Test, 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 test. Okay. I think so. All right. Get it started? All right, guys, so thank you for coming. Our goal today is just to introduce this idea of a network state to everybody. We'll give you, I think, a pretty thorough rundown. It's our first time doing this deck. We put it together last week. So next slide. Hang on, we're figuring out how the technological part of this works. Okay, cool. And can we do a full screen? Wyatt, are we able to cut any of that or no? Okay, so we're not going to do a full screen, everybody. What's that? F11. Try F11. We got pretty smart people in the room. Smarter than Wyatt and I. You are limited by the projector. Oh, yeah. Okay. Right on, guys. So my name's Matt Harder. I'm founder of a company called Civic Trust. We help cities run civic engagement programs where they take a piece of the public budget and get input on how to spend it and then vote on how it's spent. So it's kind of like a accountability thing, a transparency thing. So I'm interested in innovating government. And I also lead TNS Boulder, which stands for the Network State. That's a local meetup that we do bi-weekly. Every month we will do an official meetup, and then every 2 weeks we'll do a happy hour where we kind of go deeper into certain topics and have a couple beers and some pizza. And then another initiative called Network State Connect that we'll talk about at the end, but it's dedicated to educational concepts around the network state and all the different kinds of technologies that we get to play with in the network state.
I'm Wyatt O'Rourke. What about now? Yeah, there we go. I'm the founder of Basilica Wealth Management, RIA focused on bridging the gap between traditional financial services and Bitcoin financial services. I'm a huge Balaji fan. Network State's a bit of a passion project of mine. I am a member and founding board member of the Space Denver. We have a couple members here in the crowd. This is Denver's first and only Bitcoin Citadel, so we're really proud and excited to get that off the ground. And so, like Matt said, we want to take you guys into the world of network states. So this presentation is built off the ideology created by Balaji Srinivasan. I know it's super cheesy, and I hate saying this word, but he's actually a futurist. He's a very smart, high-powered individual. He's founded multiple biotech startups. He was the CTO of Coinbase. He's worked at A16Z. He's taught at Stanford. He has multiple advanced degrees. And this is rude to me to assume because I've never actually met him, but my hunch would be that the network state is his life's work or his crowning achievement. It's certainly what he likes to talk about most. And Balaji, being the genius he is, has a unique capability of distilling complex topics into simple concepts. And so when he wrote the book, The Network State, he opened it with a network state in one sentence and one image, which is presented on the screen here, and then into 1,000 words and one essay. And so the one sentence here is, a network state is a highly aligned online community with the capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. So,
I was going to say, and we're going to unpack those terms in the course of this, so don't worry about memorizing that.
Yeah, so some key definitions to get started. A network is a system of interconnected entities that communicate and share resources with one another, enabling the exchange of information and data. A nation is a large body of people, usually associated with a particular territory, that's sufficiently conscious of its unity and seeks to possess a government, particularly of its own. A state is a territory of government, and a nation state is a sovereign state inhabited by a relatively homogeneous group of people who share a common nationality. So one of the things that might come to mind off the bat here is that there are many nations within a state. Catalonia is a nation within Spain. There are multiple Native American tribes that are nations within the United States, the state.
So these are some characteristics just to keep in mind of a network state, and we're just giving you a little bit of frameworks here at the beginning, and then we'll go more in depth in terms of examples. but digital first. So the digital network of the internet is primary. So we do all of the main coordinative actions on the internet. That's where it begins. The composition of network state is composed of a national network, so the equivalent of a nation, and a governance network, right? And so you've got a community of people that want to work together, and then they have an agreement about how they're going to work together. You could be a member of multiple network states. One aspirational thing, and we had a fellow from Ethereum Denver come and speak. One aspirational thing is the laws of the governance network are written in code to specify what is mandatory, encouraged, discouraged, or forbidden. And so this idea of having enforceable laws that are actually written as code. Now that's something which is pretty far away, because making, like on-chain things actually like reflect in the real world is challenging, but that would be an aspirational thing. And then the last bit here.
So Pax Bitcoinana, I asked Matt to reserve this one for me. I am a self-identified maximalist, which we'll have some interesting Q&A here later. But this is a play, obviously, on Pax Americana, and this is directly from the book. And so Balaji describes this as the ultimate guarantor of exit, and the network state system at large is Bitcoin. As cryptocurrency rises in strength, Bitcoin becomes a government of government. It sits above every state and constrains it from printing infinite quantities of money, from lawlessly seizing the funds of its citizens, and from waging forever war. Might sound familiar to some of you. And then I want to specifically highlight this last sentence here. In doing so, it limits that which will never limit itself. So we're kind of trying to introduce here idea of coded governance, and specifically touching on the Bitcoin network. The Bitcoin network is the most decentralized network man has ever created. Its participants cannot be deprived of the rights it provides them, and incentivizes them to keep it decentralized. Bitcoin, in my opinion, is the only logical foundation for network state societies to build on top of.
Okay, so you can achieve a network state in stages. Think of a network state as a final achievement of an experiment in gaining sovereignty using the internet, right? So you could start with something like a startup society, which is an internet-first, small, problem-solving community. I don't know what a good example of that might be, but even something like Fiverr or something, where it's not quite a community, but it's a place you can go to get something done, right? You've got a lot of people there, you can get things done there. And then as you move through parallel society, network union, you develop more of an economy. So a network union, a wholly digital entity that engages in collective action on behalf of its members. So that's where you can go and actually, a network union, you might have had something like, let's think of the Arab Spring as like a potential kind of pop-up network union. We're all going to get together. We're going to use the digital tools to create some big shift in the physical world, right? Now it wasn't persistent, and it wasn't able to actually create solutions on the other end of it. So it's not perfect, but it was this example of a digital coming together. So a more persistent version of that might be a network union. A network archipelago, you're actually starting to drop down into the real world. And that's where you have to be able to make plans to really govern, to hold these assets, and then live together. And then the final state is the network state, where you have diplomatic recognition. And we'll get into the different ways of getting that. So this is something which, we don't know what the timeline would be on something like this. A really broad way of thinking of it is right now, the way that we live together, these legal jurisdictions we have are based on geographic boundaries of the nation state. And this is kind of saying, with the internet and the tools that the internet offers you, what's the next evolution in that form of organization, right? And we presume it starts with the internet. It uses things like Bitcoin, which are stronger than nation states. No matter how strong a nation state is, it cannot extinguish a network like Bitcoin, right? So you take these things which are stronger, and then you iterate into new ways of organizing, right? And so that network state is this sort of final evolution of that could be decades away.
This is one of my favorite graphics Balaji has created. So he calls this the multipolar global landscape. So this is kind of playing on the fourth turning thesis, Ray Dalio's changing world order. So we're moving from a unipolar global order. At the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States had economic and military hegemony. And with the rise of China economically and the failure of the U.S. militarily, he predicts this multipolar world moving forward. So we have this triangle, right? And so in the East, represented by China, we have total state control. The state Leviathan, it knows what you buy, it controls where you go. Their prerogative is to control everything. In the West, we're moving towards a more oligarchic control. So Balaji classifies this as woke capital, perfectly summarized by the New York Times logo. And so the idea here is it's more of a passive, aggressive control. This is up for debate, especially in this room. But theoretically, in the United States, like the state, can't clamp down on your freedom of speech, but they will try to cancel you, right? And so this is like the idea of where they're using their talking heads. This is like the passive aggressive way for the powerful elite, or proximity to the money printer, as I like to think about it, to clamp down more on this control. And so we see like the United States and the West representing the economic left here. Then the network, which is decentralized control, is represented by Bitcoin. And this is our solution. This is our saving grace. Obviously, as we will elaborate more on, an open source protocol guarantees our permissionless and fair transactions and our ability to interact in a global community.
Okay, so are network states plausible? Thank you. Okay, we're done. All right, okay. So first, what we want to use is this construct, this idea of a plausibility structure. So what is it that makes something plausible? We would argue that network states are just basically made up of constituent parts. If you have all these parts, then you can bring the parts together and create something new. So an example here is Uber, right? Uber could not come into existence until you had smartphones, like a personal device that had GPS, that had mobile internet, digital payment systems, cloud computing, and machine learning to route everybody and create search and make search pricing work and all that. So you needed all these different technologies to come together, and then you get this new thing that completely changes the way that you do transport. And these examples there's plenty of examples of things like Amazon with logistics, and you just needed these technologies to exist, and then this new form can exist. Okay, so with network states, some examples of things that we need, which already exist, are things like cryptocurrency, so a currency that cannot be controlled by a nation state through force, a community platform, a way for millions or billions of people to get together and communicate. 20 years ago, this would have been probably thought of as a little ridiculous, but now we have several of these networks where a billion people can jump on and coordinate in a kind of loose way. You'd have online governance, which we have increasingly in a lot of experiments in the DAO space around that. You have something here, I have an illegible network. So you have to have a network which cannot be read by the powers that be. You have to be invisible to the US government and these different large nation state entities, or they will just try to control you. So you need to have the sophistication to keep them out. You need to be able to get land. I would put there in the form of special economic zones, SEZ. So really that's just a host nation that's willing to sign an agreement with you where you can hang out, bring all your rich friends, build a bunch of cool stuff. And 60% of the world would love to modernize like that. They'd love to just have a bunch of people show up on their land and start building things, right? So I think that's going to be really possible. And then just an economy, some kind of digital economy to tie it all together. And so we would argue that a lot of these pieces already exist, and it's a question of assembling them to get to this next stage. So what we're going to do here is we're going to quickly go over the 4 things from that original sentence. So do these things exist? To what extent do they exist? So an online community, yeah, we've got social media. We've got X, Facebook, chat, Discord, Telegram. All we need for TNS is a private full-featured chat app. You just need an app where you can do that, where the government cannot, boot you. And so I would argue that it doesn't yet exist because all of these networks are under the thumb of the government completely. Even X doesn't really have true freedom. But we have the template and we know that it works. Capacity for collective action. So arguably Bitcoin is one of the greatest examples of that, where you can get people to just collaborate and work on something that achieves over $1 trillion of value, and they continue to do it because the incentives are aligned. So these things do exist. They do exist online. And I have here, Arab Spring, OWS, these ways that something in the digital world that sparks in the digital world finds its way onto the soil and creates a shift. And as I mentioned before, like that absolutely does happen. It's just a question of how sophisticated your communications and your systems are to allow that to be persistent, because both in the case of Arab Spring and OWS, they turned out to be disasters because they were very good examples of the revolt of the public. For anybody who's read that Martin Gurry book, the public can revolt, but then they can't build the next thing. So we need to become a lot more sophisticated.
Yeah, and so one of the things that was hardest for me to grok, when I started exploring network states is, and Balaji does such a beautiful job illustrating this, but it's like identifying the power that networks have. Specifically, I'm going to dig into a little bit more of social media here, because it's kind of like these invisible edges, right? There's no border. Like we can identify the border between Canada and the United States and Mexico. There's no border between Facebook and Twitter, right? It's this invisible thing that the people have given power to. And networks had to earn their legitimacy in the eyes of people in power. So I want to go over 3 examples here over about the last 20 years where I think it was a really eye-opening experience for the legacy bureaucrats. So first we start with the Arab Springs in the early 2010s. Social media, Twitter, famously gave the people and the participants in these uprisings the ability to get the word out, the ability to organize, and the ability to bypass state media. That's an Easter egg. Then we have Brexit, right? This, I think, is about 2016. Social media proved to be another very powerful tool to disseminate information, mobilize supporters, and frame narratives. And this really kind of shook up the global order when the UK left the European Union, and the elite bureaucrats really didn't like that. They can't play fling golf. I'm not surprised, but... and then kind of the last straw, and this is up for debate, but was Trump getting elected. And after this, the powers that be decided to go full psycho mode and violate your rights as Americans and humans. So a couple years later, this ultimately leads to Elon buying Twitter, right? And he wants to make this the free speech platform. So he brings in a team of journalists to kind of air out Twitter's dirty laundry. And this was, come to be known as the Twitter files. Matt Taibbi was one of the contributors. I have a quote from him I want to read so we kind of get an understanding of how powerful the bureaucrats the bureaucrats came to recognize the power of networks. And so Matt says, this was on his interview with Tucker Carlson a couple weeks ago. He said, "The big thing that we found was that there was a nexus of communication between government enforcement and intelligence agencies and the internet platforms. They had a very sophisticated bureaucracy that was involved with controlling content in a variety of different ways." So all this to say of why networks are important, because the bureaucrats and people in power place importance on them, right? They wouldn't have set up these structures and co-opted these companies if they didn't think they were threatened.
Amen. It sounds like we have a Matt Taibbi fan in the house, too, which is fantastic. He's my favorite journalist, and his show, America This Week, I think is the best show on the air right now. So, all right. Plausibility Imperial Institutions. So crowdfunding territory. So who here's heard of Prospera? 1, 2, 3, 4? 4 hands. Wow. We need to kind of educate this crew a little bit more on, there's a massive libertarian experiment happening right now in Honduras. There's a private city called Prospera where people have massive jurisdictional latitude from the government to self-govern and collect taxes and spend them how they want. They have cool ability to do medical experimentation and stuff like that. There's a persistent pop-up city there called Vitalia that people can apply to go live at. So it's one of the forefront libertarian experiments in the world right now happening in this beautiful island called Roatan. Talk to me more for other information if you're interested. But that exists. Liberland. Who here's heard of Liberland? More famous, less successful. Okay, twice as many hands. But they don't have any structures. They're not doing anything. So Prosper is way more well-financed. But you see these experiments exist, and then I would put special economic zones there just as something very important. But this idea of getting land from like an existing nation state is something that we can definitely do. And diplomatic recognition, Wyatt, you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the end goal for any network state is diplomatic recognition. And this is a little hard for us to imagine because it hasn't officially happened yet. But we do have some examples, arguably the best ones being the Knights of Malta. Admittedly, they're a bit of strange birds. They started out as a holy order helping pilgrims in the Holy Land at the time of the Crusades. They set up hospitals and cared for the sick. They ultimately, gained wealth and recognition and developed some military prowess. And after, the Christians lost the Holy Land and the Crusader states fell, they kind of escaped to the islands of Rhodes and Malta, where they maintained their philanthropic, mission of helping the sick, but also had a formal military and nation state of their own. A guy named Napoleon came along and took over their island, disrupted them, and so they fled to Rome. And to this day, they're under the order of the Vatican, but not under direct control. But they do maintain their sense of a nation. They have permanent observer status on the UN. They have diplomatic relations with 113 countries. They have the ability to issue their own passport, mint their own currencies. The buildings in Rome are viewed under the same lens as the Vatican from the Italian government. So those are sovereign territories. So we have a nation with diplomatic recognition without a state. Why is now the time for network states?
Okay, so historically, networks and technology disrupt hierarchies, right? That's something that we see time and time again. So in the top example, I give examples of technology, and the bottom I give examples of networks. So the printing press, right? You have this new technology. All of a sudden you get mass literacy, leads to the Protestant Reformation and the Scientific Revolution. So just like this one tweak in the way that we do things can just absolutely change the way society is organized given enough time. The steam engine creates the Industrial Revolution, creates a whole new merchant and worker class, and it just destroys feudalism, basically. Now all of a sudden you have an entirely new form of organization. Technology completely changes society. Telecom and the internet, you have the information revolution. This is ongoing, but it empowers the citizenry, leads to things we mentioned like Arab Spring and stuff. And this is what we're in the midst of right now, is this internet revolution. So then you also have the American Revolution. That's a network of scrappy, little states, I don't even know, colonies taking over the global empire and completely winning because hierarchies tend to just be stodgy and old and suck at adapting. And so when they're at their weakest, which is what we're about to get into, that's when networks can actually be most effective against them. The Enlightenment, same thing. Philosophers and writers and thinkers come together with, and they're sense-making together, and they're trying to push ideas forward, and that led to democracy to a great extent. That was a lot of our founders, for example, were heavily influenced by them. And then even abolitionists, that was a network. Underground Railroad was a network. So these things are extremely effective over time.
Unfortunately, fortunately for us, the West is ripe for disruption. Balaji lists a handful of reasons in his book that I'll read off here on why he believes the West is falling and then how we can reverse it. So he believes that political polarization is way up, hard to argue with that. State capacity is way down, even harder to argue with that. Economic prosperity is declining, envy is increasing, foreign military defeats, U.S. states are pulling away from the feds, authorities lost respect, radicalized movements are the status quo, and Bitcoin seizure could be a trigger event similar to the gold seizure executive order. So our institutions are in decline, but they often, like Matt was saying, require networks to disrupt them. Networks require technology and innovate past hierarchies and break up old power structures. So the dynamic we're currently living in, and this is our opportunity as entrepreneurs and technologists and people who have a vested interest in their friends and families and own communities, So networks allow us to win in an internet native institutions. They allow for instant feedback and analysis, mathematically certain consensus rules.
And we should probably pick it up a little bit and try and end at like the 45. We want to give you guys time for Q&A because we end at 8 or whatever, like this section. No? It's like a little blurry? Okay, cool. All right, cool. So fourth turning lens. So we're going to talk a little bit, just for a second to put it there, the fourth turning as like a way of viewing that this is a time for disruption. Who here has heard of the fourth turning? All right, good. We like to see those hands because fourth turning is the most important lens you can have for what's coming, right? So you have the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and then the crisis, the major upheaval of the social systems and them being destroyed. And that's where we are. You see the arrow. So we're at the fourth turning. I think many of us acknowledge that, which means that we can anticipate the breakdown of the existing institutions, forcing their reconstitution because there'll be a high on the other side, which will be us using, hopefully, the technologies that we're developing now and the systems that we're developing now. We're sort of preempting this rebuilding by using those technologies now and coordinating technologies, right?
So a couple illustrations here to illustrate the Western decline. This is a Gallup poll that polled participants on confidence in major U.S. institutions. I apologize, the print is a little small, but this is essentially 40 years of data, and in those 40 years, confidence has declined 50%. This is the M2 money supply chart. This is published by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. As you'll notice, we kind of start exponentially increasing here. That spike towards the end of the graph is in 2020 and the COVID stimulus. These numbers are getting so hard, it's hard for us to grasp. The 2008 bailouts, a TARP program that was $800 billion. COVID came out to around $6 trillion. So we're just talking about an order of magnitude that is so much larger. And just for context, 8 trillion seconds is 31,000 years, right? So it's like they're just printing $1 trillion every 100 days, and it's like we can't even like keep up as humans with like how big a numbers these are getting. So moral of the story here is that the velocity of money printing is increasing. Broad money supply has increased about 6% year over year over the last 10 years. And in my opinion, nothing says your government hates you like this graph, right? You're getting debased, you're being stolen from, you're not seeing any return on this spending, and your dollars are going to service debt and human suffering.
We are based, they are debased. This is U.S. debt by presidency. This is a really, really good one because you see that to try and pay off this debt, we would require this revenue and deficit. And when you really just internalize that graph for, 5-10 seconds, you see the utter impossibility of it. It's completely impossible. It will never happen. So when you realize the government's going for broke, then your openness to reformed institutions becomes, quite a bit wider. And then, just to show the way that these institutions are completely failing, look at U.S. life expectancy versus healthcare expenditure per capita. I mean, it's a joke. It's a global joke. These people administering our social systems cannot perform. They simply can't perform, right? So this idea of creating something new and just assuming and accepting that these people are on the way out. They're not going to reform these systems. That's where we're at. That's what the network state is about, thinking, anticipating. What's the next form of healthcare, assuming that the people running this are already completely beyond hope, right?
Fortunately for us, network states will win. They are the most democratic and decentralized form of governance. We will prevail because we can all participate and build. So I think the two biggest technologies and social movements supporting this thesis is obviously Bitcoin. It's our ability to economically opt out, and then it will be network states, which is our ability to organize socially and opt out. Then to just kind of really hammer home this point about old hierarchical structures is part of like the weak man phase of like the fourth turning we're in is this incompetency crisis where these bureaucratic blobs have gotten so big, they consume so much, their output is so little, where it's like it's trying to turn a freight ship in like a small harbor. They're getting just far too large for anything productive to come out of them. So they need to be disrupted.
Okay, so what are network states doing now? We'll give you a couple examples so you have a sense. Firstly, just to put it here at the end, keep in mind these things are peaceful. Okay, we want to make sure that this was put here. These are opt-in, non-coercive, non-violent. There's no overthrowing. Occasionally, we have people come to our meetup and they say, when are we overthrowing the government? I said, we're never overthrowing anything. You're a Fed. Experimentation. So also, one way to think about this is just as Bitcoin seemed like a LARP until more recently, the current network state movement is more focused on experimentation and building community than gaining diplomatic recognition. We're more focused on that kind of like upper left side of the different stages. So just keep that in mind. We're experimenting. There is an ecosystem. There's a lot of different companies working with, so this is called a startup societies landscape, so network states specifically are here, but all of these work together, right? Infrastructure, startup cities like Prospera is here, as I mentioned, but there's a lot of them all around the world here. Co-living, investors, institutes. There's actually a more modern version, but it's less aesthetic, and so I didn't leave it in here, but you get a sense that there are a lot of organizations pushing in this direction. There is a network state dashboard. If you go to thenetworkstate.com/dashboard, you'll see over 60 experiments currently happening. This is kept by Balaji and his team. It's not very active, I would say. It's not like a great source of truth, but it gives you a sense that there are a lot of people trying to put these groups together. You also get the sense that it's very early. We run an organization, Wyatt, myself, and several others, that have been part of a server with Balaji when he was writing the book, The Network State. After he was done, okay, so a little background. When Balaji was writing the book, The Network State, he had a server, a Discord server, and we would meet in VR weekly and talk through the different ideas. And he would like release a PDF and talk about, here's what I'm thinking of putting in the book, and he would kind of try it out on this audience of 125 people in VR. And we did this for 6 months together, and we all bonded about nerdy governance topics and had a great time. And then when the book was released, we just sort of played around a little bit more. And the server still exists, but we're no longer super active. So some of us broke away and started a new organization called Network State Connect, which Wyatt is involved with as well. And what we're trying to do right now, just to give you an example of another active project, is give people education around topics which we think are of value to any network state citizen. Anybody who's going to be a member of a network state, so future-oriented, technological, et cetera. They're going to want to be good at financial sovereignty, so this is mostly Bitcoin. Also, Yonks is part of our group, so thank you, Yonks. You've been doing some work on our wallets over there. Data communication sovereignty, how to keep that hidden and safe from the government. Health sovereignty, so how to measure your own well-being and be in charge of that as opposed to just sort of like showing up to the doctor and seeing what they tell you. Civics and civility, so this is about being in the place that you live and actually having a network and having a community there, because you can't live entirely in the cloud. You're just not going to get enough dopamine that way. You have to have friends. And so we want to help people with that as well. Governance, making decisions online. Creation and digital influence. I think this is a bit of, anyway. Yeah, so basically content creation is what that should say, and digital influence. And then AI. So these are all the different things that we think would be the basis of any network state. So we're going to teach people these different things and then help them find network states to join.
So in closing here, some key takeaways on network states. So network states are grassroots movements, right? They're led by the people. These movements are peaceful revolutions. Individuals simply choose to opt out, which is their human right. A quote here from Julian Assange on the grassroots is, to combat the elite, we must not petition, We must take it over. We must form our own networks of strength and mutual value. Very powerful. Network states are non-adversarial. Network states innovate and compete on ideas. Humans are technological beings. We compete on ideas. They are not a kinetic call to action. And then network states are jurisdictionally specific. So Matt kind of talked about around the world, special economic zones are a little more popular. So those are like carve-outs that follow a different set of rules than the rest of the state. I think there are some very cool and unique opportunities in the U.S. Given our federalist roots. I'm a patriot. I'll go down with the ship. But as an entrepreneur, I'd much prefer to build solutions. And I very much, align with Balaji's thesis of, states taking back their power, right? So people will vote with their feet. They'll vote for their dollars. They will move to U.S. states that they align with. We're starting to see some of this on the Bitcoin front, where Louisiana, Oklahoma, Idaho has passed Bitcoin-specific legislation that will ensure your right to self-custody. It will ensure your right to mine. And we really started to see this trend during COVID, where states taking back their power. And Balaji, I think, uses a great analogy from the movie Pacific Rim. I haven't seen it. I might butcher this, sue me. But moral of the story is, some monsters rise out of the sea. Humans can't fight them, so they need to build robots to fight the monsters, right? And so his network state analogy is, so the monsters would be the Fed, the federal government. Citizens and companies, being the humans, we can't fight the Fed ourselves. So we need to harness the power of robots or the individual states to play on their level and meet them where they're at, and then compete on this mutual playing field. So states versus the feds.
Yeah, and I would just say in closing, it's a community that's future-oriented. It can be very valuable to sense make around other people who have these priors. Like, for example, I say to the room, how many people have heard about the fourth turning, and I get a whole bunch of hands. It's really good to try to figure things out with other people who have these frameworks, right? Like, they're going to be more accurate in their assessment of the future. So it's really good for sense making. And then ideally, this helps you prosper, right? This type of knowledge should help you navigate into the future, and being around other people that have these frameworks should be helpful. Oh, so final things. TNS Boulder exists. You can find us on meetup.com. You can talk to Wyatt. You can talk to myself. We meet, as I mentioned. We have an official meeting once a month. We have a happy hour once every 2 weeks where we go over some of the other topics and just have fun and drink beer. But we also drink beer at the main meeting. Network State Connect. You can talk to us about that. That's coming out in the fall, where we have these educational curriculums, and it's like a cohort-based curriculum. So you meet people, you hang out, you gain skills. It's social. And then you can follow Balaji here as well. He's got Wyatt put a couple of the really famous podcasts, the Tim Ferriss 606 and 547, Upstream 24. I would also say the TFTC Balaji interview was fantastic if you're a fan of Marty Bent and Tales from the Crypt. And then his Twitter is Balaji S. I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Questions?
Hey, so I heard you guys mention the words democracy and governance a few times, which are kind of trigger words for this crowd. And I'm curious, is it because it's a purely voluntary agreement that you think that that's actually a peaceful thing, or?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I really view network states in kind of that lens of the grassroots movement, and if we can use technology, like cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin, and enshrine the agreements that we mutually decide to live by in code, I think that gives people a lot of power as opposed to a more hierarchical, top-down power structure. I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that, Matt?
Let me make sure I understand your question. So you're just saying that a lot of people don't like democracy, so why are we talking about it? Oh. Yeah. Right. Here's what I would say about that. Yeah, I'd say we use the term, or at least I use the term very loosely. I just mean the people have a say in what manifests in terms of their governance. I don't mean one person, one vote. Certainly don't mean the parties. I think the parties are gangs. I hate the way democracy is practiced in this country. I have a lot of problems with it. I think whatever we would come up with, hopefully, like, we didn't get into this at all because it's not technical network state stuff, but a democracy which runs on the internet should be way more pluralistic. And as a libertarian, it should be way more federalist too. It should be way more like, okay, you can be over here. So let me put it this way. Network states, as we mentioned, are opt-in, right? And so assuming they are democratic, or that many of them are democratic, because some won't be, I suppose, you will go to the one that you actually think is representing your rights properly, right? And you're going to have an array of options that are not geographically bound. You can, go to different ones. You won't be like born into one. And yeah, they will compete for you, right? That's the whole, anybody here know Patrick Friedman? He was like the Seasteading Institute founder. He gave a really good talk at the Network State event in Amsterdam in October. And that's what he talked about. He's like, you want governments that actually like compete for you. Like they treat you like a customer, right? And they want to give you a 5-star experience. If we could just take that orientation of the private sector, the market-based, function, and put that onto government so they competed for us, like that would solve, how many things would that solve, right? So network states would seek to do that.
So you mentioned one part of the network state was land eventually having a place. And doesn't a physical location make you vulnerable?
So the idea is that it would be an archipelago, right? And so I'll give you the example of Prospera. Prospera exists geographically in the island of Roatan in Honduras, right? But it also has alliances with other jurisdictions. So if the government of Honduras wants to renege on an agreement, which they have tried to do, Prospera was able to, one, rely on international courts because it actually had the standing to do so, and won, by the way. It beat the nation state. But also, it can exert pressure on that nation state based on alliances it has. So the answer to the question, I would say, is the pieces of land will probably be small, especially in what's conceived of right now. Imagine an area of 2,500 to 3,000, small village kind of a thing in a beautiful area, and an archipelago of those. When you have partnerships with these different jurisdictions where you're putting these things, you can use those to exert pressure on a government which is kind of doing things against you. But your valuables, to a large extent, are online, right? It's like, when you say it's makes you vulnerable, I think one part of this is because we're not going to have big standing military. It's going to be like, look, if you want to mess with our city here in Ecuador, go for it. All our wealth is on chain. Like, you can't have that. That's not here. And we're going to use alliances to put recourse on you, but you don't just like go down all at once. That's the thing. It's like other countries, that land is everything to them. For us, it certainly won't be.
On the same topic about land, I'm wondering what inferences we can make about the way that, let's call them hosting nations, would treat network states based on how the past independence movements have been sort of treated. I'm thinking of like Catalan and Scotland and some of this, right? Those could have been peaceful, negotiated settlements about, okay, you have this land and these rules and we're going to stay here and all that, but it wasn't that way. They were suppressed in various ways. So I'm wondering, that's not exactly the same story here, but I'm wondering what inferences we can draw about how network states would negotiate successfully with countries when independence movements haven't been able to.
Yeah, no, it's a great question and fair question as well. So I kind of harken back to the idea of moving to a multipolar world instead of a unipolar world, and I think this is harder to imagine in the larger nation states, like China or the U.S. Fortunately, we do have the federalist system, but I think in a multipolar world, smaller countries will be much more viable and competitive in a global landscape, and we've kind of seen this with Estonia and their like e-citizenship. So I think I'm hopeful, at least these special economic zones will be embraced, and they'll try to attract talent and capital as we move towards a more globalist world. People opting in and opting out and moving to jurisdictions that will support them.
Yeah, and I think your question is interesting as far as like what can we learn from them. I would say there's certainly not a one-to-one connection. It's not that it's not a good question; it's a good question. But like I was just in Spain in March, and like I was in the Basque region, and you have the Catalans, and like they have all these really proud groups. Now, if Basque were to secede from Spain, which they have a right to do, Spain would lose land, it would lose a tax base, it would be humiliated, and so Spain doesn't really want that. And then they lose the Catalonians the next day, right? They don't want that. Now, a network state would function completely different at the negotiating table. What it would do is it would go to a much poorer country than Spain. It would go to like, somewhere in the bottom third or whatever. Like currently, where is this working? It's working in Honduras. That's like practically, I don't want to say it's a failed state, but it's not doing so great. And then you have like who's modernizing like crazy right now? El Salvador, right? You've got Bukele, right? This like startup type leader embracing Bitcoin. So you go to a leader like that, somebody who's enterprising in a nation that has a lot less to lose. I lived in Latin America for 5 years, and I go down there all the time. They have so much undeveloped land because they're incapable of developing it, because the regulatory system is awful and their infrastructure is bad. So you go to them, they have an abundance of land, and you find somebody who is much more savvy, like a Bukele figure, and you go, hey, I want to bring 3,000 or 4,000 really smart people down here and open up this sort of jurisdiction, get out of what they talk about a lot is the jurisdiction of the FDA, making it impossible to experiment with biotech. So it's like, we're going to create all these incredibly lucrative things here, getting out of the orbit of the FDA. Now, you might take a little flack, but look at Bukele. He's not afraid of taking flack, right? Like, he's pissed off the whole IMF, like he's doing great. And so you go to them and you say, we're going to make a lot of money, and this is going to make you famous, and you're going to be, you're going to go just like El Salvador could do in the next 10 years. You're going to go from the crappiest country in your continent to one of the most prestigious. That's something network states can offer people if they have like a first mover, if you have like a good community. And as we mentioned, land comes last. So we've already built the community at that point. When we're at the negotiating table, we've got an on-chain GDP. We've already got an economy, and we're prepared to go in and make those infrastructural investments because we need that physical jurisdiction at that point. So do you see how that's a completely different proposal?
No, because I'm looking at the question that I have is, as your networks begin to scale, how does it comport to the non-aggression principle? Eventually, all the networks are going to look towards having a singularity of some sort, and that's going to cause some aggression on someone. Not everyone is going to be able to win. How do you consider those networks making everyone being able to win?
I just think successful networks will take over other ones, and then yeah. Well, but keep in mind that the main factor here is a person who's choosing another network. So for a network to die, the network doesn't exist. It exists online. It's a kind of mutual consensual thing that we're using technology for, and maybe there's a bit of a land archipelago if they're really successful. But for a network to shrink and die, and for its membership to go over to one that is actually able to administer itself, it's a lot like the public education system and the charter school system. It's like if you have charter schools that are excelling and pulling students over to them because of a market force, that's not bad. That's not sad. I don't care if the public education system is losing pupils, because whatever is more effective is gaining those people. You know what I mean? That's kind of how I see it, at least. I don't think that aggression has to come into it, as long as they're able to, accept it. Yeah.
Yeah, over here. So one of the things that I was wondering about on the economy side, and you were mentioning, all the wealth is going to be online, but do you think there should be Bitcoin or whatever should be backed by a real good behind for this to work, or you think it's not a problem? Because I could see, for instance, at some point one of these network states say, you know what, scrap Bitcoin, we're gonna go with somewhere else, and all of your wealth in Bitcoin, it's not gone. While if you have something backing it, I don't know, I'm gonna say gold. Okay, you change the currency, but the value is still with me. I still have the gold. So I'm curious whether that is fundamental to avoid the problem that we have right now, the printing money and blah, blah, blah. And I know that Bitcoin is limited, but they could change it. You know what? We're going to use Bitcoin 2 and we do 3 trillions Bitcoin. And here we go again.
I would love to answer that, but why? Do you want to go?
Yeah, so I think Bitcoin will be the foundation of any network state, particularly economically, is because it's the most decentralized network known to man, right? So any choosing to opt into a network that is not Bitcoin, you're inherently choosing a less decentralized network, right? And participants will make their own series of preferences and trade-offs, but you are kind of putting yourself behind the proverbial 8 ball, because it's extremely hard to replicate what Bitcoin has done. It's a grassroots movement, right? Saylor has this great quote I love where Satoshi found a way, he made a way, and then he gave it away. And so no other proof of work network has the node infrastructure, the mining infrastructure. It's like that's really hard to replicate. And so certainly it's possible, but then your netizens will have the ability to exit and move to the most sound and decentralized network.
Yeah, and I'll just say quickly, it's a fine question. I think it's going to be up to the country. We just predict that that Bitcoin will be the basis of it because, I'm a maximalist, you're a maximalist, so I think that it has the best chance of being a world reserve currency, right? The game theory in my head says that when all these different adversarial nations have to find a way to trade, they're not going to want to use the dollar because it's inflating, and they're not going to want to use whatever China comes up with because they know it's going to be surveillance, money and awful. Commodities are really tough because how do you custody them? You know what I mean? You trust Germany to do it for you or Switzerland? The U.S. just went in there and smacked Switzerland around with all the, private bank accounts. So that custody is going to become a huge problem if you use commodity money. And so I think the game theory dictates that it goes to Bitcoin. But that doesn't mean that I'm right. It's just going to be whatever those nations want to use, those network states rather want to use. And we'll kind of see.
Okay, so I got him next. You guys talk a lot about technology and basically how this concept couldn't have existed prior to recent developments in technology. Other than Bitcoin, what technology do you think really enables this, and what's really important for developing a actual network state?
Do you want to talk some on DAOs?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think some of the smart contract stuff. I mentioned I'm a Bitcoin maximalist, but I'm a monetary maximalist, and so I believe that it's the best money, but I don't believe it's the only blockchain. So we do use things like Ethereum attestation service, Ethereum name service, and so we use what do you call the type of SBT, soulbound tokens, right, for credentialing. So we use these so I think a lot of the different on-chain stuff is valuable. To me, it's just not money. That's all. Don't get confused, about but that, again, that's almost we don't have to get into that argument. I think the idea of having something on a blockchain, like a sort of ledger that you can refer to, all of these technologies are essential, because you can't bomb Ethereum either, right? And so all of these things are super important. I would say that's really important. All kinds of peer-to-peer technologies. I think it's going to be a big suite of technologies ultimately that we're going to want to use for this. A lot of technologies don't exist yet that we're going to need. I think, for example, have people here used Discord? It's like Slack. Yeah. It's like a chat. You can run a community on it, I don't think that we have yet cracked that nut. Like, how do you get... If you have 50,000 people trying to coordinate on a thing, and you've got bounty systems out there, and you've got credentialing systems, reputation systems, and you're trying to coordinate on it, the interface of Discord, it's just a giant chat, is a complete and utter mess, right? And it doesn't matter how many channels you have. There's just no way to dice it to where all of a sudden it becomes like an actually really organized town square, right? So I think this whole thing of creating these online communities, we can kind of bootstrap them and get started and do stuff, but that persistent ability to be effective as a community in a way that's actually pleasing I don't think that's been figured out yet. And that's partially why we lean on the in-person side too, because don't try and get all of your fix from a Discord server. Also have friends in the real world that you can do fun stuff like this. Wyatt invited me to do this, because we're friends in the real world. that's a network state, but it's through the network state, right? It's through the network state meetup. And so it's also have that so that you can kind of cope with the technological, as the technology is getting there.
Definitely. And, I do think about this a lot. And, I think, Noster and decentralized, communication networks like that will be pivotal. And one of my favorite Liberty on the Rocks meetups was when Federated Computer came and gave us a talk. And I think it will be a little bit of a return of back to the basics there of individuals taking it upon themselves to host their own software. I think that will, enable a lot of freedom. We have talked about some of these walled gardens and these, mega tech companies that, mine your data, sell your data, and I think that will be, a pivotal part. And something we're trying to do at TNS Connect too is give people, the education, the courage needed to, take control of your own data, be a sovereign individual. Start9's a Denver-based company that's doing a lot of great work on that front as well.
I think we're all Bitcoin lovers here, but I'm curious to learn a little bit more about one of the pillars you guys talked about, which was this concept of an illegible network, something that is private and does not have the ability to be surveillanced by the government. And I think Bitcoin fails at this. Now, I think Bitcoin's great and meets, the majority of the things we need for a network state. But I'm curious specifically on this core pillar, how we can have a currency like Bitcoin and have a successful network state with its inability to be private.
That's a good question. Yeah. So when I use the illegibility example, I just use that as kind of an example of something that we're going to figure out. So I don't use the term pillar, but that's fair enough. Yeah. So I guess to understand your question better, you're just saying that the transparency of Bitcoin specifically will make it not functional as a money.
Yeah. I mean, again, we're all Bitcoin lovers here. I think the majority of us probably hold a lot of our wealth in Bitcoin. I still believe the most interesting use case for blockchains is money, and Bitcoin being, the pillar of that. I'm just curious. I think it in some ways is contradictory to this idea of a private network, because Bitcoin's not private.
Okay.
And I'm curious just on the thinking, and I don't know if Balaji is has said Bitcoin is the only the best use case for a network state, or if other currencies have been thrown in the mix, like Zcash, or name your private blockchain that's trying to solve this privacy problem. But curious specifically, a lot of these things are all around governance, surveillance, and having the idea to opt out. And
yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, I would just say quickly on it, I'm not against swapping in and out of Zcash or Monero or anything like that. I think that's fine. I think different coin joins and different ways of anonymizing Bitcoin transactions could and should be used by individuals that need to. In the case of a state, we're talking about network states, you do actually want a lot of that to be transparent, right? Just monetary transactions, that's a transparency thing that you actually want transparency from that. From the perspective of people at the bottom layer, yeah, I mean, so one thing is to use Monero or Zcash because of transparency reasons. Another is to hold a big chunk of your net wealth in it because you believe it's going to become a store of value, right? Those are two different things. I think the first one makes a ton of sense. I think the second one, it's up to the individual to do that. But then all the communications technologies, everything else that you would use would be hidden, right? Because those are things that you wouldn't want to be. Those would be more probably peer-to-peer and stuff.
And I'll just quickly add on to that. I don't think Bitcoin is a guarantee. I don't think networks are a guarantee. As bullish as I am on both of those things, and that's more just a call to action to the entrepreneurs out there. We need to continue building these solutions. Obviously, we were making some progress on the Bitcoin front before the current administration decided to crack down on these. So particularly in different special economic zones or different places around the world where coin joins aren't deemed money laundering activity. We can continue to build on the network, scale the network, and solve some of those things.
Yeah, I would say, Fedi just launched a couple days ago, and they're doing, I think that's eCash, right? Does Fedi use eCash? So it's just all these different things are completely kosher. And the idea will definitely be that it is a plethora of different things. When we talk about Bitcoin, not to speak for you, Wyatt, but I think the idea is not this is the greatest coin, there is no other coin, everything sucks. It's that this is going to be the crowbar that we use to pull ourselves away from the state because it has such a robust or such a robust network. And it is stronger than nation states. Whereas, as much as I love Zcash or Monero or these other coins, I just wouldn't say they have that power. You know what I mean? They're not going to go in and interrupt international trade, but Bitcoin will. You know, and so we use that as like a medium of sort of power exertion, actually, power projection almost. That's what we're talking about. But then also, of course, like all the monetary purposes.
As a quick comment on that, I think the Lightning Network might make Bitcoin illegible, sufficiently illegible. So there's layers on top of it that can provide that obscurity. My question for you is, what are your thoughts about the Free State Project as a kind of proto-network state? Do you have any familiarity with that?
I have a little bit. This is New Hampshire. Huh? You can't smoke weed there? Well, I think you have your answer.
People do.
Yeah, but yeah, even though it's illegal. Oh my gosh. It's the libertarians. Yeah, they just, you know, they're not even looking at the rules on the wall. I don't know, to be honest with you, I've never been there. I've never been to Porkfest, to my shame. You know, it seems to have been marginally successful. I love the idea of living around a bunch of libertarians to the extent that they're able to like change the legislative environment to reflect that you have a bunch of libertarians. I don't know how well that's worked.
Well, I think the origin story is similar to the network state story, where they all kind of collected online for years and years and years, and then had this like assurance contract of like, if we get 20,000 signers, then we're all going to move, and that did sort of happen. And so it's 20 years ago, so it doesn't have any of the pillars and the eligibility in Bitcoin and any of that, but it seems like a similar story.
I love it. I mean, I love it. I just, yeah, it's been tough for them to, make a huge splash, I think, in that state for whatever reason. They do. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you try to click F11 again?
Yeah.
Like what browser? I mean, it's fine.
Is this Firefox?
Yeah, should F11.
Okay. Ask your question.
No, that was my question.
You're so patient to have waited so long to ask him to press it again.
So I wanted to return to the point on democracy a little bit. So for me, like a network state, I can imagine solving the problem of like digital direct democracy relatively easy among all these problems to be solved. But to that same point, democracy has a lot of problems. So like I would want something more like a republic kind of state where I have like a Bill of Rights. So what would a Bill of Rights, because as I'm sure, rights and obligations under the network state or some form of those, like how would you codify, and I know you can say like, sure, write it in code, but I'm having trouble imagining as a programmer exactly how you codify something like a Bill of Rights for, a network state.
Yeah, great question. I probably won't be able to suffice like your technical aspect of that question, but kind of how I'm thinking about it is like one of the things that made the United States great is our founding fathers created 3 branches of government with checks and balances. Those checks and balances have since been eroded over time, but the point was being that it was hard to change, right? And so I think in a more network state, democracy or diplomacy, or you don't necessarily need those 3 branches of government to check each other. It's like that can be done on more of a protocol level, and it's like we don't need to necessarily ask the judge, even though I would probably recommend that protocols can be editable, but we can just refer back to the proverbial base chain on how our forefathers intended for this network state or this jurisdiction to be run and reference that, and like the fact that it's hard to change, I think, is what really kind of will derive a lot of its power.
And are you saying specifically on chain, like a Bill of Rights on chain that would be?
That's what I'm trying to imagine what it would look like.
I don't know, man.
Maybe like freedom of speech. Not that we have to would map one-to-one with the network state, but like something that's just more like, hey, these are the things that the network state's not allowed to do. In a Bill of Rights kind of setting. So it's like how you have that reverse governance to say, hey, people can't just vote and change, all the flaws that we have.
Oh, are you almost saying a voting protocol of like how one would go to change a Bill of Rights or something like that?
Like again, direct democracy.
Yeah.
And that seems like the easiest part of this problem to solve.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, how do you have a check on that direct? Protecting individuals. How do you have a Bill of Rights?
Yeah.
Those kind of notes.
Well, I'll tell you. Here's a kind of I'm coming at it from the side a little bit because the answer to your question is I don't know. It's going to be very tough. Here's me coming from the side. You're going to have a lot of different types of experiments, right? So, like, I personally believe in libertarianism because I think within a libertarian system, you can have everybody can live within a libertarian system. I see no reason why like Massachusetts couldn't run off and be the most socialist state in the world within a libertarian national system, and that would be perfectly fine. and then all the smart people would leave Massachusetts, hopefully. And then that would be that. But under a socialist system, you cannot do that, right? If it's a socialist federal system, then everything is, it's scorched earth beneath it. And so with network states, you're going to have like a diversity of different types of government, right? And then the ones that are, libertarian, or the ones that are kind of most freedom-loving, that protect the freedoms of the individual, which was something the U.S. did successfully for a very long time. We've got over 2 centuries of like a pretty good track record. Even to this day, look what's happening in the UK. Have you seen this stuff where somebody's like posting the wrong things online and the cops show up at their house and they're talking about criminalizing a retweet and all this kind of crap? I mean, this would have been considered utter dystopia 5 years ago, conspiracy theory talk. Now it's real in the UK. Same thing will be happening in Canada. We don't have that problem here. So like, not yet, but thank God, right? And so that's the thing, is like these things are really strong, and then so I think that you just have these models, and people have to choose in what kind of system they want to live, and how important is it to them, right? And I think you're just going to have network states reflecting those desires in a different way with different levels of robustness, right?
My concern is not like when I join the network state, it's going to be in a certain place. It's like over time. It's like, yes, I can switch presumably, but like I'm probably also invested like moving to another country.
Hear you back.
Oh.
We're going to move on to the next question. Two more questions, and then we're done.
We'll talk after.
So my question is, there's some states that are seeing a growing sentiment for secession. I mean, we'll find out in 50 years or something if anything happens. But what if if the secessionist movement organizes online, a bunch of secessionists get together on Discord and decide for Texas to secede? I mean, would something like that?
Say something about that?
Could that potentially be like a network state?
I mean, I don't think it's a network state. It's a very different scenario. I personally believe that it would be great if when states decide to self-govern. I think that's a fantastic thing. I think that states should be part of the United States because it's an attractive proposition. And certain states could walk on their own 2 legs, and Texas happens to be one of them. But no, I don't think that really has anything to do, because what they would do is they would fall back on the systems that they already have. That's the thing. It wouldn't have to be a network state in any way, because they've already got their own physical capital. They've already got their own standing military. They've already got everything that they already have. The energy system. Do you say no Bill of Rights? Their own Bill of Rights. Oh, their own Bill of Rights, right? Yeah, it's Texas. I mean, it's the Republic of Texas, right? And so, yeah, I think it would be a completely different thing. I think it's cool, but not a network state.
Yeah, and my personal hypothesis is, I definitely don't advocate for secession, but what I ultimately think will happen in the U.S. federal system is that the feds will just render themselves toothless via never-ending money printing, and the blue states will be left holding the bag, and the government, the debt that the federal government occurred over time, and the red states that opt out will hopefully be on some sort of Bitcoin standard, and so the union itself will maintain a loose connection, but it's going to be much more states functioning with each other, and the feds just having less power and oversight because they will cease to function properly and efficiently.
Last question. Do you guys worry about government sabotage, CIA, deep state agents getting in and sowing discord?
I mean, personally, yes, but this is a global movement, so I'm like optimistic on the U.S. outlook, but and that's where it's like anything that threatens their power, is inherently a threat to them. So that's why we advocate for a peaceful revolution. Peaceful revolutions win when they outlast the tyrant. So it's not going to be easy, but we just stick to our ideology. We work together. We maintain peace, and ultimately, I think good prevails.
And I would just say, they missed a couple weeks ago, and so the incompetence crisis is real, and that's on our side.
That's our talk. Give it up for Matt and Wyatt.